Hazard and Risk Management. Today's event, Thursday, 25th of March 2021, is organized by Occupational Health and Safety Master's Program, Faculty of Public Health, Universitas Indonesia, and also supported by Universitas Indonesia Alumni Association and the UHS Student Association of Faculty of Public Health, Universitas Indonesia. First, I would like to welcome to Dr. Tony Green, the Director of ArtSep Pacific, and then I would like to welcome Professor Sabarina Prasetyo as the Dean of Faculty of Public Health, and also Ibu Indri Hapsari Susilowati, PhD, as the Head of OHS Department. And also, I would like to welcome Bapak Dr. Zulkifli Junaidi as the Head of OHS Master Program, and also Professor Fatma Lestari as the moderator. And I would like to welcome the lecturer from the UHS department. And also I would like to welcome all participants, our OHS fellow students, alumni, as well as practitioners from various industries who have attended this event. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Miranda Suryawardani, and I will get through this event as the master of ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to explain the schedule for today's event. The event of today's event will be opened by the Dean of Faculty of Public Health and also the head of OHS Master Program. And then we start the presentation from the speaker, then followed by a Q&A discussion session. And ladies and gentlemen, I would expect you to pay attention to these following matters. First, please turn off your microphone as well as your video. You are not allowed to screen share during this event. If you have any question, please write it down through the Q&A section with the format your name and then your question. It is expected that all participants to fill the attendance list on the link that we will be sent via the chat column. Ladies and gentlemen, in accordance to the OHS requirement in Universitas Indonesia, first I will deliver the safety induction. As today's event is conducted online using the Zoom platform, we would like to ask all participants to pay attention to the visibility of your PC, laptop, or your mobile device that you use. Secondly, please make sure your sitting position are safe during the session. And also, please pay attention to the electrical hazard as well as such as charger cable or switch around you. If you attend this seminar together, please do the physical distancing all the time. And please stay healthy during the COVID-19 pandemic and also practice 5M, wearing your mask, hand washing, physical distancing, avoiding crowd, and limit your mobilization. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start, let's us say a prayer to God Almighty. Please start praying. Yeah, pray over. Next, I would like to invite Bapak Dr. Zulkifli Junaidi as the head of OHS Master Program to deliver a speech. Please, Pak Zul, time is yours.
Hello.
Yeah, please, Pak Zul.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Miranda, for the time. I would like to say thank you to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning for all participants and also for all speakers in this international guest lecture. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for Dr. Tony Green. He was my lecturer more than 20 years ago in Department of Safety Science in University of New South Wales when I did my master degree. And also, I would like to say thank you for all the lecturer, all academic staff in Department of Occupational Health and Safety, Faculty of Public Health, University of Indonesia, and also for the Dean of Faculty of Public Health, Professor Sabarina. I would like to inform this international guest lecture is one of our program to achieve the international accreditation, and also international benchmarking, and so visiting a professorship. Last year we have a grant from Universitas of Indonesia to develop all the programs, something like international benchmarking. And at the moment, we have a collaboration with the University of Queensland and also other university to related to our program in achieve the international accreditation. So for all the participants, thank you for the participants. At the moment, we have more than 700, almost 800, maybe will be more than 1,000 because the participants in our registration about 2,000 participants. And we hope today we can improve our knowledge in major hazard and risk management from Dr. Tom Green. And we hope this is very useful and beneficial for our students and for alumni, and also for our partner in industrial in Indonesia. That's all my opening speech, and I thank you very much for all the stakeholders who support this international guest lecture. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Pak Zul. And next is the opening speech from the Dean of Faculty of Public Health, Professor Sabarina Prasetyo. So I would like to invite Professor Sabarina.
Thank you very much. Very good morning, Dr. Tony Green from Australia. It must be, it has already been afternoon. So thank you for joining us, and also your kindness to give and share about the major hazard and risk management. I think thank you for this being a guest lecture in our study program in occupational health and safety. I think first of all, we thank God Almighty that allowing us to gather here this morning and have Dr. Tony Green and other colleagues here to discuss about the important issue in occupational health and safety. And I think this lecture will be useful for the students as well as the practitioners. And also we can share what is the field experiences, and also to see what is the better knowledge that we will take into our consideration. So I also thank to Professor Fatma Lestari and Dr. Zulkifli Zunaidi. Dr. Zulkifli Zunaidi, thank you very much for bringing this guest lecture for the students, and also to the head of the department and Professor Meli and other colleagues from the Department of Occupational Health and Safety. And thank you for the students as well as the participants that your availability in joining this lecture is very important, and we are very appreciating this kind of a lecture. So without further ado, I think I will open this guest lecture officially, and hope that the discussion will be fruitful and everybody will take the lessons learned, and Dr. Tony Green will share his high experiences because the Dr. Tony Green is a very prominent researcher, I think, and also the advisors of our colleagues here, Professor Fatma, Dr. Zulkifli, and also Dr. Chandra. So again, thank you very much and enjoy the discussion. Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you, Professor Sabarina. And then I would like to ask Professor Sabarina to deliver the certificate of appreciation to our speaker, Dr. Tony Green. Please, Professor Sabarina.
Dr. Tony Green, this is the certificate of appreciation from the Faculty of Public Health. Thank you for your kindness to share your experience in especially in this major hazard in risk management. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope I'm worthy of this appreciation.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Sabarina. And then before we start, I would like to invite all panelists to take picture together. So please activate your video, and I would like to ask help from the host to take the picture.
Okay, I will count for the take picture. 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think enough. Thank you, camera.
Okay, thank you. Now we're gonna start the presentation with the speaker, but it will be guided by the moderator, Professor Fatma Lestari. Before I invite Professor Fatma, I would like to introduce our beloved moderator. Professor Fatma is a professor of OHS Department in Faculty of Public Health Universitas Indonesia, and she is also the head of Disaster Risk Reduction Center, Universitas Indonesia. She achieved her bachelor and master's degree in chemical and her PhD in safety science from University of New South Wales, Sydney, Australia. And Professor Fatma also participated in many organizations such as UN Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group on attack, and then Indonesian Safety Council, and also a member of US National Fire Protection Association. So please welcome Professor Fatma Lestari.
Thank you very much, Miranda. Allow me to introduce Dr. Tony Green. He was my former supervisor during my study in University of New South Wales, and also our lecturer for our colleagues in Occupational Health and Safety Department. So he is now as an independent researcher, director of ArtsGov Pacific, and also principal visiting fellow from School of Computing and Information Technology. Previously, he was the lecturer in University of New South Wales from School of Safety Science. And he is a member also International Association for Fire Safety Science and other standards of Australia. So I welcome Dr. Tony Green to deliver his presentation, which are very interesting today. And please have your time.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Yo. I hope I've got that right. And of course, Professor Zulkifli and Fatma Lestari for your introduction. Today, I want to talk about major hazards risks and their amelioration. As Professor Zulkifli will know, the major hazards course that I gave must have been over a decade ago, was a 10-week course. And I can't get all that information into a single lecture. But what I thought I would do is just have a look at some of the risks. And I hope that works, yes. And how people tend to think about risks, because if you don't get that right, you will never actually stop having major hazard accidents. So if we can start, I hope this works. Yes. As you can see from that, probably most of you will remember last year there was a huge explosion in Beirut involving a ammonia store, ammonium nitrate store. And that caused the devastation that you see basically in terms of radii from the center of the explosion. It seems to have been started by a fire that then escalated to include the store. But the reason why ammonium nitrate hadn't been moved from the store was more political than it was to do with necessarily the operation of the actual store. The second one I'm going to show is
the eyes of the world today stunned by this image. This was debris from a meteor racing toward Earth, streaking across the sky there, crashing into the ground in those woods. And look at some of the other images emerging tonight. The cloudy trail the meteor produced, and on impact, this, carving a little pool into a frozen lake. It's the biggest meteor in more than a century to hit the...
I'm not going to show that for 30 minutes, but that was the bolide that came across Sibilinsk in Siberia in Russia a decade ago. In fact, just over the 10th anniversary of that incident. The senator that's responsible for that area in Russia was telling me that over 1,500 people were injured from that, mainly from flying glass due to the shockwave that occurred. So I want you to start thinking about, are these both major hazard risks? And what distinguishes the two? And what are their similarities? And can they both be controlled? It's a difficult one to answer because depending on your perspective, you'll have different views on all these. But these two are examples of major hazard risks. So I want to actually talk about how you distinguish the two. Well, one's obviously a natural phenomena. Nominally, there's no control, but that's with modern technology not necessarily true. If you can see where it is coming from early enough, because you've got time to intercept. And there are international collaborations going on at the moment to look at these near-Earth or object disasters on a worldwide basis and understand them better. And we don't understand them properly so that we can actually control them. On the other hand, the Beirut one, we understand that a lot better and it could have been controlled.
The planet, this one crashed in Russia.
No.
1,000 people were injured from shards of flying glass. And
that's it. So what are major hazards? They're basically hazards that, if they occur, will cause death and injury both within an organization and outside the organization. You often find that there's collapse and damage to property outside an organization. And in the extreme events, collapse of societies and support structures occur. So that it takes a while for the society to get back to where they were before the accident occurred. One of the reasons I'm showing the Icona satellite view of northern Sumatra after the tsunami in 2004 is that the total society structures were actually wiped out in that event. But the problem really arises, comes about in major hazards because you're dealing with low probability of occurrence with high impact. And of course, unless you understand how you can get that actually occurring, you tend to put it to one side because there are other objectives that in an organization which you're much more comfortable with dealing with. So some of the problems are maintaining a state of safety so that the systems that you have fail safely and don't actually fail to causing problems outside your organization. You often find that inadequacy of controls is one of the reasons, even if they're maintained, why you get failure. And organizations as a whole tend to focus on officially. Although when you dig a bit deeper, you usually find that that's only in terms of monetary rather than safe operational conditions at all times. And you have other instances that really come around from this drive to efficiency, the downsizing of personnel. But if you downsize too much, you don't have the people that can spot the problems arising, and you lose the technical knowledge of how to deal with things on site. Technology change can introduce new hazards into the systems that you haven't really thought about, and you really need to consider that in the planning stages of any operation. And focus on immediate timescales rather than including what can happen in the long term and how many of your controls might degrade over time. And of course, the other one is you ignore human behavior in both often the risk assessment in the first place, and also how human behavior can actually undermine, maintaining safe environments. So one can consider risks in terms of tame risks. These tend to be dealt with independently, so you concentrate on one system only and analyze it as an independent system from other systems. And there is no risk feedback from other systems into the problem you're trying to assess. The benefit is usually it's quite quick to do, and it allows a description of risk in terms of likelihood and consequence on a continuous spectrum, so that you can make judgments about where you want and what type of controls you can have. The other type of risk, really, systems, is or are wicked risks. They occur in complex and complicated risks, and most organizations that have major hazards problems are actually quite complex in the way they operate. So there are substantial feedback mechanisms that lead to long tail risks if the system is analyzed as a tame risk. And that usually comes out as a low probability, high impact event. But you find that in these systems, high impact risk can occur when certain conditions actually line up. And it's why back in the 1990s, that is, there was a move towards defense in depth in terms of your control systems. Since then, there's also been developments in international risk standards for this area. ISO 31000, the risk management standard, provides guidance and principles on how to manage risks in organizations. And the substandard 3110 actually discusses risk assessment techniques. Now, there's some 30-odd techniques that are identified as being useful in this area. But the risk management standard itself doesn't say that you have to use one technique or another. It's what is most appropriate for the systems you're analyzing. But one of the problems is that you tend to end up analyzing risks in terms of tame risks rather than wicked risks. And of course, one area that has its own standard is managing legal risks. And that's because companies, large-scale companies, are actually concerned about reputation and public liability. But there are other standards that hang off this, like the, I think it's 28,000 standard, which is for chain linkages in for delivery of food and other articles in society. They all rely on this risk management standard. So let's have a brief look at what this standard actually is asking us to do. So first of all, the definition of risk is a bit different from what most people in the safety area think as risk. It's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. The effect is a deviation from what you expect. And it can be both positive and negative. The fact that it's a deviation from an expected value suggests that you have enough data to actually make a statistical determination of what the problem is. And with major hazards, you often find that type of information, particularly on causal factors, is missing. Objectives can have different aspects, such as financial, health, environmental, strategic, organizational wide, or project levels. And you can apply the same sorts of processes to anything that you do. But you do need to recognize that different domains tend to look at risks differently and have different outcomes. And some of these are useful and some of them are not. Risks are often characterized by potential events and consequences, i.e. you're guessing effectively what can happen by combination of different types of factors. And you often find that they are then defined in terms of consequences and the likelihood of occurrence. And as I was saying earlier, that's due to treating them as tame risks. And there's uncertainty in the actual state, even partial deficiency of information related to understanding or knowledge of an event, its consequence or likelihood. So again, on major hazards, you actually find that there's insufficient data on how factors come together to actually cause coupling between different parts of the organization. There's often insufficient data on what the actual scale of impact is going to be. You know, it might go across your boundary, but then it sometimes gets a bit difficult without a good modeling to determine what or who is going to be affected and what the uncertainties are in that sort of estimation. And there's often insufficient data on escalation pathways of that impact. And I'll give a few examples later on. And of course, in any modeling, there are always assumptions that are made about the modeling, and sometimes you have to dig quite deeply to understand whether the modeling is really appropriate for what you're trying to model. Even though it might come up with an answer, it might not be appropriate. And are the controls adequate for the magnitude of impact that you expect? It might stop it part of the way, but if the controls get overwhelmed, you end up with the full impact of the event. And of course, the impact of behavior on causes and how that actually causes the escalation paths is not well understood at all. So you've got a number of caveats when you start dealing with quite complex systems. Now, there's a class of risk events that are commonly called black swan events. They've arisen because in Europe, anyway, no one had seen a black swan until they came to Australia. So they're supposedly events that are unforeseen and have unforeseen consequences and not within experience. And the logical deduction from that is that it won't happen, cannot be foreseen, and therefore cannot be controlled. But really, what you find is something entirely different. Uncertainty in complex and complicated systems means that rarity of events leads to little analysis. It's the inverse Pareto law. Now, the Pareto law tells you, is often used in management, that if you can get something 80% right, it will work okay and you'll have time to fix things up. You can't do that with major hazards because something will go wrong and it will escalate. So you actually have to look at what are your top events and come back from that on how you actually control them. You find that there's a lot of rationalization goes on after the event and politically, typically politically. And historically, they're often considered as outliers. And that comes back to being solely reliant on statistics driving how you operate. But the reality is the factors are not static, they're dynamic. So they keep on changing. Dynamic behaviors are poorly understood because they themselves are complex mathematically. And they're often ignored because there is no immediate impact. So the assessment ends up focusing on static assumptions, which are themselves inadequate. And then you have the difficulty of funding, either internally within an organization or from the public purse, to actually fund adequate control. So you can get a situation where basically the management processes pushes it out of sight, so it becomes out of mind, and you actually are doomed to failure under those circumstances. Now, as an example of a black swan event, Hurricane Katrina was considered unpredictable in strength, landfall, position, storm surge height, and rainfall. But by the time that happened, there had been a lot of technical developments that had produced 5 categories of increasing strength, where there were good estimates of wind strength, good estimates of storm surges, good estimates of height storm surge height and rainfall. And better satellite tracking allowed you to model reasonably well the estimates for landfall position. What you had was the levee construction was actually equivalent to a Hurricane 3 control. So it would never stop a Category 5 hurricane actually making landfall there. and swamping New Orleans. The levee was 1950s construction. It was known to be vulnerable in the 1990s, but there was really no real review of how to actually deliver a safe levee for the population. And it was politically expedient to focus on other issues rather than spend the money on raising the levee wall. The Tohoku tsunami in Japan in 2011 is another example. So there are hundreds of stones like the one shown in the diagram, which was above Fukushima in Japan. The inscription, which Mark Willesee translated for me, was, "The homes on higher places will guarantee the comforts of descendants. Remind the horror of the tsunami. Do not build homes below this point." You'll notice that this is an intergenerational warning to future generations about the dangers of building below that stone level. When the earthquake occurred, 25% of the homes built below that level disappeared in the tsunami. And as we know, many lives were lost in that. You find that you often only takes 3 generations to repeat history, although history doesn't exactly repeat. Those who experience it don't tend to repeat it because they really know how it's going to affect you and society. They teach it to their offspring that provide adequate warning to be cautious. But their offspring don't necessarily get the same message and therefore ignore history. But you find in indigenous cultures like we have in Australia that are 50, 60,000 years old, that the oral tradition, because there are many who learn these stories across 3 generations, all sitting around a campfire, make sure that the 3rd generation actually know exactly what the story was and are chastised for not getting it correct. So history also provides us with a way that you can sometimes deal with trying to stop things from repeating. But coming back to your own organizations, how do your managers behave? Do they ignore warning signs when they are put to them? Do they have KPIs that are properly aligned to looking at the major hazards risk you might have within the company? And is it consistent with your risk history, what you're doing? The Millennium Bug, is it fact or fiction? Many younger generation people think it's fiction. But the problem was first identified in the late 1970s. It gained traction amongst multinational energy companies and banks in the 1990s and governments as well. And the concern was over embedded process logic controllers. These were on individual bits of equipment. They weren't linked to the internet, but they had limited word length for their processes. So you came and found that you had different results depending on the word length in your processor with addition and subtraction. There was something like 28, 30 dates that then had different problems. Some of them are shown there. The last one is in 2038, so we're still working through this. But by 1998, there were software solutions for networks and connected applications, but there were still no real solutions for isolated PLCs. In 1999, the FTSE 500 companies did tests on their organization, and 33% of them reported problems, and 90% of those problems were believed to have caused serious disruption had they not actually done something about it. In the event of 2000, there were something like 4,000 events worldwide. Nothing really significant. The most serious was actually on a nuclear power plant in Japan. But it's thought that there was quite a lot of underreporting, and the reason for that is companies didn't want reputational loss. So, and another example, this last year, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic. It's thought to originate in bats in China, and the first identified case was in Wuhan in December 2019. One of the problems is, in a pandemic, the population doesn't have any immunity. So there is an urgent need to develop vaccines that control and immunize people against it. In January 2020, scientists in China actually gave the genetic code for the virus to workers in the West and in other countries. And it allowed unprecedented financial investment and scientific collaboration worldwide to develop new vaccines. Currently, there are 7 vaccines that have been rolled out worldwide, with over 200 vaccine candidates under development, including ones that they hope will prevent some of the problems that are starting to emerge from mutation changes with the virus. Now, some of these mutations have occurred. There are 17 or more changes to the spike protein. The one from Southeast England is one of them. The one in South Africa, another in Brazil. They've got these enormous amount of changes compared with the Wuhan virus. And some of these have been associated with increase in transmission rates. It's not clear at the moment whether you've also got increased severity, but don't be surprised if you do. Current vaccines seem to be slightly less effective against highly mutated strains, but if you can actually get the population vaccinated with a large enough, the actual cases and spread of the disease decreases quite dramatically. And hence the mutation rate in the virus also decreases. So all of these are examples of major hazards. And there are lessons that one can learn from this. Hurricane Katrina, for example, the knowledge changes over time. So you have to have some means of picking up the knowledge base is changing worldwide. And can allow for alternative decisions. Human decision is often based on expediency, but expediency does not control a major hazard. And a failure to adapt systems to new knowledge can be very costly. The tsunami is an example where history is gradually lost unless it's compensated for. The maximum event must be considered at all times. And talking about that tsunami, the actual Fukushima nuclear power plant had a defense against tsunami. It needed to have been 15 meters high to have actually prevented a washout of the reactor in the event. The Y2K problem, early identification of the problem, and then a critical mass to actually do something about it. And action prior to the event always limits the loss. And again, you see that in the pandemic, early identification of the genetic structure both reduces time for vaccine development, but it also allows for testing and tracing to actually keep the numbers down that stop hospitals being overwhelmed with very sick patients who are going to die. So when it comes to your critical systems for major hazards, have you analyzed your system without any control? What would happen? Because that gives us an indication of what your top event is likely to be. What changes in systems will lead to disaster? Because that gives you an idea of the access paths to disaster. And do your critical controls that you have identified actually produce the result you want? Or can they be used to ensure that you fail to safety if they fail? And how can you ensure that critical controls are maintained? And again, that relates to how information loss occurs within an organization because of the movement of people between jobs or from jobs or just retirement and things like that. And how do you capture and retain the critical decisions in your organization that made sure that you had enough controls in the first place? Because new board members, new managers were probably totally unaware of why these decisions were made and why you need to maintain them. So there are challenges for risk quantification because a lot of the work when it comes to actually looking at physical effects requires modeling and quantification from that. So you often find that there's coupling, increased coupling in systems and geographical sense. Everyone's familiar with vehicle accidents, common medical conditions, workers' compensation, and insurance that deals with those types of things. And of course, there is a lot of actuarial consequence assessment to set insurance premiums. And there is a lot of data about that one can use to actually reduce the incidence. And that will be the subject of a lot of your other courses, I suspect. But as you get to other systems, the coupling increases. So for example, chemical plant is a single plant, but oil production is an extended field geographically. Power generation is probably in the wrong place. It's generated singly, but it has extents in terms of couplings to grids for distribution of electricity. Tsunamis are events that are effectively localized, but they can still have effects half a world away. And then there are food chains. While you might have local supplies, interruption to those food chains can cause famine quite quickly if you can't maintain your food chains. And of course, these can be worldwide, these food chains, and the same with supply chains. So you've got individual events can be poorly quantified, and it's best to start using aggregate events from around the world to inform on how your systems might react. And motivation in terms of human behavior is poorly measured. So some of the things that don't get done are actually to do with how people are motivated in particular jobs. And again, you've got interdependency between the connectivity and geographical extent. Pandemics, aircraft flying from one part of the world to the other, have introduced the pandemic from one country to another more rapidly than historically would have occurred. The internet gives you an interdependency in society. If you lost it, how would people communicate? Are they still able to communicate so that your social fabric doesn't actually fall apart? Terrorism, it's often organized from across the world, even though the events might actually be carried out locally. Global warming is a long-term coupling of different parts of the climate system. And it is, worldwide. And cyber attacks, again, can be started in a country that you've never heard of and yet develop into a major attack around theft of information and that type of thing that can affect your operations. So there are challenges on how you can analyze highly complex systems. And it requires more complex methods and broader thinking. People often think about Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the one people should go for. But people forget that there is a caveat to that. That while that is true, it's only true if what you're looking at is as complicated as the system that you're analyzing. So you can easily get to the situation where you think it's a very easy solution, but because you haven't taken complexity into account, it's going to fail. Perception is another thing that's poorly understood. Because you're dealing with risk and risk scenarios, you've got to have the scenarios. And that depends on your history of the individual and the history of organizations, of how different people perceive things can occur. And that can cause problems in discussion about what risks are actually important. So there is a need to develop methods for perceived risks that parallel objective methods of physical hazards, for instance. And then there is value correspondence. How do you trade off between security and freedom, for example, or between supplying certain things for society against the other risks you might have in the organization? And again, new methods and metrics that cope with diverse values in social groups become important. And we've seen this in the last 4 years in the US, where political popularism has been driving a lot of the politics that's going on, but that's not necessarily good for the actual country as a whole. And even if you could quantify the risks, you've still got challenges in risk qualification of identifying what the risks are and how you can control them, because you've got many domains of influence that are actually impacting on an organization. You've got politics and regulation, economics and finance, systems designs, operation and emergency procedures, just to name 4. There are others. And each of those has a number of factors that can interfere with each other. And then over that, you can overlay the hazards and threats that can, in each area, that can actually lead to quite serious problems. For example, corruption. Bhopal in India, site for the Union Carbide plant before it sort of exploded, or was actually due to corruption in terms of land use with local politicians. And that started the ball sort of rolling of why it was an inappropriate location. The standards were different from a similar plant that was operated in the US, for example. So you've got those types of impacts that actually do make a difference to your risk, particularly where you're involved with international organizations or international companies. So how do you actually start analyzing this? Well, logic trees and logical processes are a good start. For example, in the gas industry, you can, let's see if we can get that going while I keep talking. Rupture of a pipeline, high pressure pipeline ruptures. It doesn't look big, but it can cause an enormous problem. And of course, the rupture can give you a release of gas that doesn't necessarily ignite immediately. It can do, but it doesn't necessarily do that. You can have delayed ignition. You can also have confinement and semi-confinement. And consequently, you have a range of different outcomes. But by using logic trees, you can actually sort out what the difference and then see how well they're controlled. Another one on in the petrochemical industry are tank fires. You've got cause of a critical event that can lead to a rim seal fire or a full surface fire. And let's see that. This is a test of a system to how to deal with a rim seal fire. But if you've got lack of drainage on the tank roof that causes collapse, you end up with a full surface fire, and that's an escalation. If there's too much water, it causes overfill of the tank, and you end up with a bund fire. Too much water can also accumulate in the bottom of the tank, and you end up with boiler. And lack of cooling water means radiation can cause failure on the second tank and rupture of it, and bund overflow and fire spread. So you have to think about how these processes actually occur and can be controlled. Another example is an attack on a company or a political target or infrastructure. You have to think about how visible is the target you're considering. What's its layout? Is it critical to other systems? Do you have enough surveillance of it so that you can actually get pre-warning as opposed to post-warning, or post-analysis that allows you to capture people? And what are alternative targets? Because you'll often find that there are different targets that are in society that you can try and push them elsewhere if you're in an organization. And what sort of weapon systems do people have access to? So weapon systems in this case is also about internet, hacking, internet, malfeasance, and data. With physical spaces, how is your space actually used? Is it clustering? The design, and are there interconnections? If you think about high-rise buildings, you often find there are two alternative escape routes. But the problem is they're often built around the central process, so that if one gets blocked, you can usually find the other gets blocked as well. Whereas if you had totally independent means of egress, you could get everyone out of the building. Logistics, how do people have access, and how would you actually deploy a specific type of weapon, whether it's on your computer system or whether it's physical? And what routes do they need to overcome? One of the problems with MH370 and the loss of that aircraft is that there was suspicion about whether the satellite communications have been interfered with. And both Boeing and Airbus went in effectively into lockdown to actually examine that in great detail. So you've got, coming up to the end.
All right.
That's all right. Now you can see that one's prevention, the other is the sort of response. Again, you've got to ask yourself questions about that. And effectively, what you're doing is trying to map out in some way how the hazards combine with threats to produce a top event and how they can be controlled. And you've got to take into account escalation controls on how you actually do it. I'll skip. I was going to talk a bit about behavior and other things, but I will skip that. You can see from what I've been saying that there's actually a framework for risk evaluation, but unfortunately it involves a lot of different domains. And that is because these are not simple risks. They might look like it on the ground, but in fact there's a lot of dynamics associated with it. So you have a means by which you have to measure your system performance all the time in the various domains to actually provide feedback on whether they're failing or not. Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry I didn't quite get through it, but any questions and discussion? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comprehensive presentation, Dr. Tony Green. I would like to invite our colleagues from Occupational Health and Safety Department to provide the question and answers. So please, the panelists, question and answer. Is there any questions for Tony Green from our colleagues? Dr. Zulkifli or Mufti? Oh yeah, Mas Mufti, silakan.
Yeah, thank you for the time, and thank you for your I don't know, comprehensive, and I think it's a very good presentation. But unfortunately, we have a limit time, right? I think there's some things that can be explored. Maybe my question is, I have an interest when you say that risk evaluation is a big thing, a broad things. Yeah. How do we get maybe a good, maybe good perception in I think I mean in one page or in one perception between the between the practitioners in the field and maybe, like you say, the politician or maybe the government or policymaker. Yeah, sometimes when we evaluate the risk, it maybe, yeah, like a contradictory or have a different perspective or different point of view. How do we get these things done? Yeah, when we talk about risk, especially like now, we talk about coronavirus. That yeah, you say that sometimes history not helping. Yeah, but we have to get a good analysis. Maybe that's my question. I hope you understand.
Yes, I understand, and
Yeah.
thanks very much for that. It's actually quite a difficult one to answer, because my experience of politicians is that they want simple information. They never read anything, and consequently, it's very difficult to get complex information into a simple form. And you've actually got to get others to help you. The advantage in the pandemic, at least in Australia, has been that because the Prime Minister was fairly well on the nose because of the bushfires we'd had sort of over the previous few months, he actually followed the scientific advice, the public health advice. And that relied solely on scientific information. So a starting point for all this is, what does the science actually tell you about the hazards and threats, and also about the psychology with different types of cultures. Now, politicians like to think of themselves as a breed apart from everyone else, and they have their own culture. So you've got to understand that and how it actually works to give them the information that they can make the correct decision. And of course, death and injury doesn't necessarily sway politicians per se. Times. And if you look, the bit that I didn't Brand talking about was some of the implications of that and how people's brains actually do work from a scientific perspective. And what we've been doing over the last decade is to try and build computer systems that will emulate that type of brain system, so that you actually can overlay hazards and risks, so people can actually see and visualize what can happen. And again, science has come a long way in various fields, particularly with the physical hazards, to actually demonstrate this. But what is often missing is then the behavior of people.
Okay, interesting.
Okay.
I hope that
Thank you very
answers your
much.
question. I'm not sure it does, but
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
Pak Zul. Yeah, thank you so much, Pak Zul. Monggo, silakan.
Okay, thank you, Bu Fatma. Yeah, I have two questions for Tony. The first one is about the uncertainty factors in this management concept here, and also maybe in major hazard or risk concept. About the uncertainty factors related to the variation of resources and also contributing factors in quantifying the risk. What do you explain about these uncertainty factors? And the second one is about the new risks come from the risk control activities, and the new risk, how to prevent and also control these new risks come from the risk control activities. That's my question. Thank you, Tony.
okay. If I understood that, the first was
Uncertainty. Yeah.
Variation of reasons or
variation of the
resources.
Contributing factors to
and how does that affect the quantification of risk? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, you need, ideally, you need to be able to look at what people do within an organization and how that couples to the risks and model it. Now, you can do this. There are certain agent-based type models, microsimulation, which is what I've been doing for the last decade, is one technique, but there are others. in trying to look at how different decisions are made and how that then impacts on the overall outcome. So you need a combined model that combines both the hazard or the major hazard that you're looking at with the behavior. And I don't think, I haven't seen anything in the literature that actually does that yet. But there are groups around the world that are working on this. So I hope that answers the first one. The second one was about new risks. Is that right? And introducing new risks? Well, you've got to have a look at part is a management of change approach, so that you identify what can go wrong in the first place with the technology, and see how they're controlled and whether their failures actually lead to non-control of your system. You need to be aware of how dynamic your system is in order to quantify it. And coming back to just one involving any human behavior, you often have to repeat the same calculation. You don't need to repeat it 10,000 times, which is what the statisticians like to do. But you probably need enough examples so that you've got a good eye feel for both what the mean outcome is and what the spread in the outcome actually is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, Tony, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pak Zul. Is there any other questions from our colleagues from Occupational Health and Safety Department? All right. Okay, I think before I move to open the questions from Q&A questions, so I would like to let you know that this webinar are also open in UI TV, in UI TV. So at the moment we have a live streaming from the support of our Universitas Indonesia Public Relations. Then they open for streaming on UI TV. So also this webinar are conducted because of the support also from the grant of Directorate for Academic Development and Learning Resources that allow us to have these international guest lectures. Okay, now I move to the question and answer from the attendees. So the first one is from Ulin Niam. Shall we, Tony, do you prefer to I open the questions and one by one?
I've got it on my screen.
Oh, all right. So okay. You can go through, or you can also request.
Well, I can try and go through them. Yeah.
All right. Great. Okay.
The first one is about basically encroachment of the population around an already built chemical plant. It's a problem worldwide that occurs, and it is a role for government to think very strategically about planning rules and regulations and how you enforce them. You find in a lot of places, shanty towns in particular built up, for example, in Brazil and India, around these types of chemical plants. And of course, if you have a major hazard event, then they're the first ones to get injured and killed. So it's important that you actually have good governance of that. But one of the problems you find is that developers want to develop land near these sites and want to do that in spite of there being a major hazards plant nearby. And consequently, political corruption does often play a part in overriding these planning laws. So good governance actually requires the government to have an independent process so that you don't get interference from politicians in that process. I'm not sure whether that answers you, but it gives you some idea of the complexity that you actually find when you've actually gone and studied a lot of these types of accidents in the past. So I hope that answers your question, Lynn. Yeah. Right, Tatit. Is it necessary to create a hazard report for middle industry? It might not be necessarily to do the hazard report, but it's a good idea to actually do the methodology and go through the process to find out whether you've got significant risks that are likely to lead to failure. It's a good quantitative technique for doing that. It is used really in the petrochemical industry a lot, but it can be useful for middle risk industries where there are, say, distributions of coming from other types of factories and stuff. Because you find that, just trying to think of your hazardous zoning, for example, can be thrown up by doing that type of investigation, or whether you've got adequate zoning actually within your storages, in the way people access things with forklifts and things like that. So you only actually need the report if you actually need to make change, but it's a good idea to have data from it so that you can refer to it back to it. I hope that answers your question, Bahakwi Ahmed.
Okay. Do you need a help, Tony?
Yeah, I'm just reading it.
Oh, all right. Yep, I can help to read out.
No, it's. I wouldn't have called it a black swan event because there are methods. There were methods before 2011 to actually predict the wave heights from individual tsunamis that are based on the magnitude of the type of event or the magnitude of slippage in rock sediment and things that create the tsunami. So, and at the time of the event, I seem to remember there were very quickly examples on the internet of how the wave would have propagated. So those types of calculations gave for that event that it was going to be a 15-meter wave height. It was a 9.1 moment earthquake, which is near the top of things. I think there have only been 2 or 3 that have been larger than that in recent history. I can't say about the past. You probably know more about the Krakatoa event and the tsunami that was produced in 1886, I think it was, than I do. But modeling does give you predictions that are outside the range of the control that they actually had there. They actually only needed to raise the wall around the plant by another 6 or 7 meters, and they would have actually been safe, and you wouldn't have had the nuclear disaster you had on top of all the death and everything else. So it was foreseeable. It's an example, a bit like the Hurricane Katrina, where the technology has changed and allows you to do much better assessment of the problem. But the problem why, from what I've read of that disaster, was that you had 2 different organizations looking at the safety, and they weren't properly communicating. So it politically fell in the cracks between these 2 organizations. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
All right. Before we move to another attendee questions, I think I missed a question from Ibu Mila. So I'll read out, Tony. From Ibu Mila. From your presentation, there are so many factors need to be considered in risk assessment process. However, in practice, many companies simplify the process by adopting a risk assessment matrix that plot hazard level and consequences. What is your opinion about this? Is there anything that we can do to make risk matrix give us more accurate risk data? So please answer that, Tony.
The risk matrix comes about because you're just doing a perception of risk effectively between either an individual or a group of people. And you always end up with the same problem, that low probability events that produce a very high impact are usually not judged high. They're judged low. And that goes against basically a proper risk assessment. So it's better if you can to actually look at the mechanisms. Just trying to think. Perhaps it didn't come up. Perhaps it, I'll see if I can find the slide. It was that, yeah, I don't remember seeing the slide. I probably missed it out. But in analyzing risk, you've basically got areas where you've got good data, but there's increasing uncertainty in the data. And you have foreseen incredible mechanisms for failure. And then you then have, so fantasy, there are no credible mechanisms by which that type of act can occur, but you then have the effect of technology change can actually make some of those fantasies actually become true. So they become seen credible mechanisms for. Now, when you start looking at the likelihood, you've got an expected outcome. And this then tends to gradually increase, but you have this tail risk where there is no mitigation. Your risk exposure, which is a cost basically per annum of doing something about it, goes through unexpected, and then you have unexpected and expected. And so far as reasonably practical on that consequences scale. But you're still left with catastrophic events that can occur, and there's absolutely no mitigation of the risk. So you've got to look in terms of those types of processes of where you actually think your risk is. And the other way of doing that is to actually look at the credible mechanisms that can produce a top event. And it's why I said, have you analyzed your systems with no control? They've been built and designed. There will be in there some control, but it's probably not enough to stop escalation. So how does that actually work? And it actually requires a lot more detail than most companies put into this. Does that answer your question, Fatma?
Yes, Tony, thank you very much. That's the question from Ibu Mila Tejamaya.
Yes.
She graduated from Adelaide University and also from Birmingham University, our colleagues from Occupational Health and Safety Department.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Tony, for your answer. And now I move to the, some attendees have already raised hands. I guess they would like to ask the questions directly. Is that okay, Tony?
Yeah.
Yep.
How are we doing for time? Because I've actually got to get into Sydney after 4 o'clock. So.
Oh, okay. What time are you available
I'm
today?
okay for another quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, so I can answer.
20 minutes. Oh, all right. Thank you. I was just about to ask you. Okay. We have here Bapak Alvin Alfiansyah. Maybe Mas Ading, you can open for Bapak Alvin to speak.
I've got the question and answer thing open.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning.
Yeah. Good morning, Dr. Tony. My name is Alvin. Now I am working in Qatar, actually, in one of the biggest LNG company. I just want to have a question. Do you have any suggestion? Because recently in Indonesia, we are richer in terms of rules and regulations for the major hazard. For example, we have like regulation of how to identify the hazard since 1999, and in 2004 we have a big disaster. It is a chemical industry, and the government also released one letter how to deal with the major hazard. Unfortunately, up until now, we didn't have any regulations regarding how to calculate risk. It means how to estimate the ALAP regime. It means as low as reasonable practicable risk, or how to accept the risk itself. So in non-Commonwealth country, yes, maybe they will not adopt any HSUK standards like CHOMA, control of major hazard regulations, and there was a triangle how to deal and to estimate the acceptable risk or ALAP risk. So do you have any suggestion to us, to Indonesian population, how to deal and how to estimate and accept the risk, especially to accept any ALAP? That's all, Dr. Tony. I hope you can understand.
I understand what you're asking. I'm not sure that I can answer that specifically, but a route might be to have a look at the risk management standard, the international one, and see how they would suggest approaching it, and how you use more one method for assessing risk. Now, I don't know what risks you actually are looking at, so it's difficult for me to comment, but usually find with major hazards, it's a combination of modeling as well as assessment using other techniques. And coming up with what you think is an answer and then testing that answer against what's happened internationally. And once you've done that and you've got a test that seems to stack up with the way the international community looks at this, then you've probably got the basis for a report and actually improving your own safety. Does that make sense?
All right. Yes, I guess because this is the time limited, I will allow one more question from the raised hand. Muhammad Miftahul Huda. Are you able to talk? Okay. Okay. Maybe he's not available to talk. I will move to Ibu Nuni. Or Ibu Haruki. Ibu Haruki, please. Since Ibu Nuni not available, Ibu Haruki, please have your questions directly to Dr. Tony Green. Ibu Haruki, are you available to provide your question directly?
I think there is no response, Prof.
No response here for both, from both. Okay, now I move to the question and answer. Do you able to read to the Q&A, Tony, or do you want us to show the PowerPoint again?
I've got the Q&A session out. I just need to know who
All right.
or which question I'm dealing with.
Yeah, maybe you can see the PowerPoint that Abdul Qadir shared. This is extracted from the Q&A question. All right.
Bu Fatma, maybe only for one question because the limited time of Tony, I think.
Yes, right. Yeah, maybe you can
so I
choose
take
one
the first question there, which is from dear Kulsawati.
Maybe from
I think need to go into quite a lot of detail. It's not necessarily all the engineering detail, but it's also identifying what are the main factors that are going to affect your risks. Quantifying risks, if you can do it and have enough data, is obviously better than risks identified quantitatively, or qualitatively, should I say. It also has the advantage that once you've got that data, you can put measurement systems in place to get more data that allows you to have some assurance about whether you're controlling those factors that are important or not. Qualitative methods are actually very good for fleshing out what are likely to be the problem areas in the first place. But you do need then to go and try and measure that to see whether they're someone's perception or a group's perception or whether they are reality. So you actually do need to spend quite a lot of detailed work on that. Okay, I think that answers that question.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tony Green. I think our session already up, and I would like to thank you again for excellent and very comprehensive presentation today. And we've got a very much insight regarding major hazard and risk management. I think I would like to hand over the session to our Master of Ceremony, Mbak Miranda. Thank you.
Professor Fatma. So this is the end of the international guest lecture of today's event. So thank you again. We would like to thank you, our speaker of the day, Dr. Tony Green, and also our moderator, Professor Fatma Lestari, as well as thank you to all parties that contributed to today's event. We also thank you for your participation in this international guest lecture. We apologize for any inconvenience in today's event, and as a reminder, all participants are expected to fill in the attendance on the link that we have sent through the chat column. and the ACE certificate will be sent to each participant in accordance with the data during registration. Thus, it concludes today the event of today that organized by OHS Master Program, Faculty of Public Health, Universitas Indonesia, and also supported by Alumni Association and the OHS Student Association. Thank you again. I close this event. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, thank you, Tony, for your time. Highly appreciation about this presentation.
Thank you. And if you want to compile a list of the questions that are there and send them to me, I'll try and answer them for you.
Okay. I have recapped it and I will send to your email, Dr. Tony, for all.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tony Green.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Have a great day in Sydney.
I'll try to. I've got
Bye-bye.
I've got an
Thank
hour
you very
and a
much.
half drive, so yeah.
Participants more than 1,000.
Yes, yeah.
Tony? Yeah.
The participants more than 1,000, Tony.
Yeah,
It
that's
reached
Yeah.
above 1,000.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Terima kasih banyak Pak Zul.
Ya, terima kasih
Terima
Bu
kasih
Fatma
Bapak Ibu
dan
semuanya.
terima kasih semua partisipan. Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih
Assalamualaikum.
juga.
Prof. Fatma.
Waalaikumsalam. Makasih banyak Bu Pian. Kasih Prof Meli. Adi, makasih
Mas Adi,
Miranda.
ya, makasih banyak ya, Mbak Miranda.
Ya, Stefan,
Semua
makasih Pak
Sama-sama,
Dadan,
Pak.
Pak
makasih.
Bu Meli, Pak Dadan, Mufti,
Ya, Pak
semuanya.
Chandra, makasih.